All right, welcome to another episode of the 5enses podcast. I'm Robert Zinni, and I'm really been looking forward to this podcast since we started. If you don't know who I am or what I do, I love history. And one thing that people might not understand about history is that local history can be more entertaining and sometimes give us more questions about the mystery than, let's say, the main events in U.S. history or global history. Today's guest is local historian and author Drew Desmond. He is the publisher of the Prescott AZ History blog. He's the curator of the Facebook page celebrating historic Prescott. And we'll talk a little bit more about his forthcoming book, Murder and Mayhem in Prescott. So, Drew, thank you for coming onto the podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Like I said, ever since I met you about a year ago, I've been really looking at your blog and just keeping up with all the cool history that you have about this Quad City area. So I want to start off with, what is the Prescott AZ History blog, and what do you do with that?
Well, it started about 5 years ago, and I have a new article most every Sunday for people to read. And I currently have over 200 articles on the blog, and I think I'm around 450,000 reads, which isn't bad for the population of Prescott. And I just started because I too like history, and I wanted to give back to the community I love and hopefully promote some tourism. And in fact, about 15% of my blog readers are from abroad, from overseas in other countries. I have a big following in the old Iron Curtain countries. Yeah, it's surprising. Russia and the Ukraine, they love, the Southwest and the old Western history and so forth. So I cover an eclectic array of subjects, primarily because I wanted to see what was popular as I got into writing books. And some of the more popular pages are my supernatural and paranormal page. And also another popular one is the origin of the town names and the place names of the area, describing some of the people or events that caused a place to get its name. That's always exciting. And the address is prescottazhistory.blogspot.com. And that's the main page. And I have all sorts of indexes on there. I have a chronological index, a subject index, biographies, disasters, just, I don't know, there are about a dozen or so different indices in there. And it can be fun to, look to see what you might be interested in and find an article. And that's available and free and ongoing. I hope someday maybe to have 500 articles on there. But we'll see, how that goes. That'll take some more years, but I enjoy it. And I have a number of followers, not just on the Facebook page you mentioned, the Celebrating Historic Prescott, but I'm on Twitter, Prescott AZ History. I'm on Instagram, Prescott AZ History. And, what else? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. There's another one there. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Oh, listen to me. This is true. But anyway, I'm on a lot of the social medias, and I have a daily pick of the day on several of them, an old picture or advertisement, and a lot of people enjoy it, and everyone's invited.
Right. And I've been reading your blog for about a year now, here and there. And I just want to say, yes, there are some really cool, interesting pieces of history in the Quad City area that I never knew about. I don't want to spoil too many of the stories because I'm going to ask you later on to tell us some of the stories that you have on there. But I just want to say, kudos and appreciation to you being a local historian, because we can talk about the major world events or what happened in U.S. history, but a lot of the what do you call them? A lot of the a lot of the cultural aspects of a region is really done by the local historians like yourself. So I just want to say thank you, because I appreciate that. And when you do discover some of the history on Drew's blog or the Celebrating Historic Prescott Facebook page, it gives you a little bit more connection to your community, right? So I wanted to get into, like, you've been doing this for about 5 years now. So, like, how did you get started, and like, how do you like formulate the topics that you want to research, and how do you conduct your research on local histories?
Well, my favorite metaphor for my research is placer mining. Getting a shovel full of sand and dumping it in the sieve and looking for the little gold nuggets. And I do that basically by reading old newspapers over the internet. I'll read the papers and there'll be, Monday Club served lemon bars. Okay, well, that's sand. But then, you'll find something incredible that happened, and that's your little gold nugget. And I'll write about that. And sometimes that'll be a gateway for me to do subject searches in the newspaper. For example, recently I found an article where this guy during Prohibition had an alcohol still that he formed out of a fire extinguisher in his house. And I thought, well, that's kind of nuts, So I did a word search looking for other crazy stills, and I found several of them. But of course, when you do a word search for the word still, a lot of times it isn't an alcohol still. It's the still of the night, or he's still doing this. And you have to kind of sift through that sand to find those little gold nuggets about the crazy stills, that were there. And I did the same thing with dynamite explosions. I
Okay.
put dynamite in there and found 3 or 4 nutso examples of how people use dynamite in Yavapai County, and that made for a good blog. But it takes work, and you gotta have the love for it. But if you take your time and look through, there is a lot of interesting history buried there that is just waiting to see the light of day.
Right. So to go back with the still and the prohibition, was there a big prohibition community here in Prescott?
Yes. Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Actually, Yavapai County kind of had a reputation for letting people off easy, to the
Okay.
point where the county attorney was asking for a change of venue in Flagstaff because so many people got off scot-free with jury trials. But Arizona was one of the first places to offer suffrage for women. And consequently, I would say it was one of the first places to have prohibition. The women's vote, both nationally and in Arizona, brought alcohol prohibition into law, basically. And that was true here as well. So we were one of the first to let the women have vote. We were one of the first to have prohibition. And it lasted from before federal prohibition until the end of federal prohibition.
You see, those are the kind of histories that we don't really know about, because when you study like prohibition, they give you just a time frame. But you're saying that before that, Prescott had its own prohibition, and then it lasted until the end of it. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and not only that, it had consequences. Basically, the saloon tax was funding the library. So when they had prohibition, they had to have this big fundraiser to keep the library afloat. So, I have a story. In fact, that was one of the very first stories I wrote about on my blog, was this fight to keep the library funded, even though there was no more income coming from the bars and the saloons.
Right. So somewhat of our alcoholism can also be funneled into education in a way, right? For your public services. That's what taxes are for, right? So you take that away, where you can get the funding.
Yeah, that's right. And they had, the equivalent of what we would have today of car washes and stuff like that. The young girls dressed up all pretty and, oh, save the library and stuff, because it was the Monday Club, a group of educated women who actually started the Prescott Library. And it was the first Carnegie library in the whole state of Arizona. And these were women out in the wilderness. Many of them had college degrees, which in the middle of the 19th century was not common. But they were married to, people who were going to be governor and stuff like that. And so, these were educated people. And one of the first things the Monday Club did was prohibit spitting in the plaza. But
Okay.
because it was unsanitary and that kind of thing. And they added the feminine touch to life in Prescott, and they brought us our library. So that's a whole nother story.
Right. That's awesome. And like when you look at history, a lot of women are excluded from that, but we've seen as far as postmodernism go, they're getting these different perspectives in history. So it's not just, let's say, the winners of wars that write the history and whatnot. Because you just educated me. I didn't know that our library was founded on educated women in the frontier days or the pioneer days. I mean, those would probably have to be some badass women, not only educated, but then they could probably hunt and do other stuff here, right?
Oh, absolutely. And they would, I read one account. There was a woman who was in the Granite Dells area, had a ranch, and her husband was off in the legislature in Prescott when she was attacked by Indians. And it was her and a farmhand against, like 24 Indians. And they fought them off. And she wrote her husband there in Prescott, send me more ammunition. So, these were some just powerful women who were not afraid of much of anything. And what you talked about as far as history goes, it's really not just man-oriented too often, but it's Anglo-oriented too often. It's Anglo men have just take too much of a front seat in the reporting of history. The Chinese were here, the Mexicans were here, immigrants were here, the women were here, and they all have a part in history, not just the Anglo men.
No, I agree. Like a lot of those ethnic groups that you were talking about, they played integral parts in Prescott. And so I wanted to go into a few of your own researches that you've done. I know that I've given you topics and whatnot, but I was wondering if you have any indigenous cultures or Native American histories for us to share, because I think for me, when I came to live here about 10 years ago, one of the things was being fascinated by Native Americans. And so I've developed archaeology or action archaeology courses where I take students to these ruins and different sites throughout it all. So I was wondering do you have any some off the beaten Native American stories?
Yeah, I do. I've gotten several from a book of from our local tribe, the Yavapai, and it's called "The Oral History of the Yavapai People," and that gives some interesting insights into Indian culture that I've written about. For example, their origin story. The Yavapai believed that they came out of Montezuma's well, that they lived in Montezuma's well before it flooded. And they got word through their medicine men that Montezuma's well was going to flood, and they planted some corn, and the corn magically, like Jack and the Beanstalk, grew up to the top of Montezuma's well. And they climbed up it, and it took more than one day. They had to sleep in this thing while they were making their way up, and they get up to the top and they go, hey, this is an okay place to live. So they all got up, and then the Montezuma well flooded out. I believe it's because a chief had some sexual immorality of some kind or something. But that flood really has a lot of similarities with the account of Noah's flood. And, that's kind of interesting as well. That's one interesting story I have on there. Another one is about people that the Yavapai call the Kakaka, Kakaka. And these are little Indian people, just little people, as they would be called today, and they live in the mountains of the area, like Grand Mountain here in Prescott, and Mingus Mountain, and also Cleopatra Mountain. And these are often seen by the medicine men of the tribe. They appear and they give knowledge and education to the medicine men. And that's something that they've believed for a long time. And even the authors of this oral history book, which was written this century, even those medicine men have claimed to see these people and have talked with them and so forth. And they're interesting because they don't really fit into anything Western civilization at all. Like, they're probably closest to an elemental, but elementals live maybe 1,000 years, and these are supposed to live eternally, kind of more like an angel or a spirit being sort of thing. So it's sort of weird. And there was one account of this Yavapai person who followed some of the to underneath, I think it was the Superstition Mountains, to see where they lived. And when he came out, he was like the same age, but it was 40 years later in Earth time. He had been missing for 40 years. And to him, it was seemed like a month, and he ate with them, which is something angels don't do, but elementals do. And so it really doesn't fit at all in anything we have in Western civilization as far as what to describe these creatures as being. But that's another one that I have in my blog about the Yavapai people. That's one of my indices, is about the Yavapai people and some of the stories I've gotten from that book.
Indigenous cultures in America, that history is so fascinating, because when you're talking about the elementals or the little people that lived in mountains, I'm a firm believer that they're these myths back in the day have to have some sort of truth, and we can see through historical accounts with modern archaeology that different types of humans had different sizes, right? Like there's the Hobbit sapien, or whatever it was called, in the Indonesia. They found that it was a very small human, but they were able to create stone age tools and whatnot. So when it comes to the medicine man and Native American cultures, I believe there has to be some truth to it, because it's totally different than the Anglo or the European or Western civilizations, And I wanted to touch upon, what you're talking about, the Montezuma as well, with the Great Flood. Ever since I got into alternative archaeology and history, every origin story, every religion has some flood story. And so I'm a big fan of Graham Hancock, about his theory about before the last ice age, there was a civilization. Don't know how advanced it was, but there was some cataclysm that happened that gave us an ice age that wiped out a lot of human history. And so instead of the Genesis theory, where humans came about after the ice age, I am leaning towards more of it was a reboot in human civilization. Because if you take all the cultures in the world, especially the indigenous cultures,
Western civilization is history hoarders. We have monuments and museums and antiques and archives, and indigenous cultures don't. They aren't hoarders of history. So as a result, a lot of them don't have a written language. They're oral-based histories. So Western civilization says, well, where are your primary sources, And these indigenous cultures are like, well, don't you trust your grandparents and what they tell you? And it's just both sides, they just blue screen each other. It's hard to get an understanding when the operating system, the basic operating system, the prism that you look at all of life through is completely different. It's really tough, and it has often led to one culture taking out another out of ignorance.
No, I agree. I mean, think about what the Spanish conquistadors did with South Americans' culture, where they literally came in, destroyed a lot of their writings and artifacts and then preached their religion to that. And if you look at it as a global, it's like, as humans, we have this human story that should be global, but in different areas of the world, people try to, or cultures try to limit that access of history. And that's why it's so important that we learn different histories.
But, when people live in an area for millennia, they aren't going to be dumb. And what they say shouldn't be just dismissed out of hand. It's based on experience. And you're absolutely right. It's better to learn from these experiences instead of ignoring them or trying to destroy them.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
So
you mentioned the conquistadors.
Yeah.
And that makes a nice little segue.
Okay.
Some of their accounts, a few of their accounts, talk about seeing these beings that weren't hobbit size, but were in fact giant size, like 8 foot and bigger. And they have, there's reports about seeing some of these people even for real back in the Spaniard times. One account says that there were 6 of these Spaniards trying to carry this big log, and they were having trouble with it, and stuff. And one of these giants took it off of them, put it on his shoulder, and just walked off as if he was carrying around the groceries. And in Yavapai County, there have been 2 cases of these giants, their skeletons having been dug up. Once in 1911, off of Williamson Valley Road, in a ranch that was homesteaded by a man named Marks, M-A-R-X. And he went out one day after a monsoon, and the floodwaters cut a new wash through his land. And sticking out of this wash was this big bone coming out of there. So he pulls it out thinking it's some big animal or something, but then he finds this giant skull. And the skull had a circumference of 32 inches, which is an athletic person's waistline. That was the skull. And the little place where the brainstem goes through, a normal human, could put the skull over his head through that brainstem hole in the giant skull. And, the whole head would be rocking around in the brain cavity of this giant skull. And this Marks guy, I believe his name was Peter Marks, he went and dug around the area where this skeleton was found, and he found hooks to hook garments. He found, most significantly, metal spears and tools, which really goes against current science, dogma that it was all stone tools. There were metal tools found near the body of this giant, which is unheard of in the indigenous culture. So that's kind of strange and odd. And they also found things that might have been used for writing tablets. So, and they described the teeth as being fully 1/3 bigger and more tusk-like than humans, which made me wonder if this is a Bigfoot they found. But those metal tools, that's just really bizarre. And then a second, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say, like, that is crazy, but it's not like out of this world with that. Like, was there evidence? Were there photos taken about the giant skulls?
Yeah, and in fact, the last I heard and could research, Peter Marks did call in somebody from the Smithsonian Institute, and he came and looked at it, took notes about it, took photographs about it. I wrote the Smithsonian Institute, and they said, "Oh, who's this guy?" They don't have a record, even though the newspaper account gives his name, and they recognize the name, but they had no record of him being in Prescott looking at the skeleton, which is, kind of leads to, some theories about, what's up with that. But a second occurrence happened near Sycamore Creek,
Okay.
right where they were building a bridge um, over Sycamore Creek for the railroad, and they were putting up the abutments, and they found a giant skeleton. And with that one, they found beads from the Toltec period, which was roughly the 900 AD to about 1350 AD. And that was also, interestingly, the time of the cliff dwellings being occupied. The many cliff dwellings that are in the Southwest and in our area as well were around during that time. And some have wondered if the relationship between these giants and the normal size Indians didn't go sour, if they didn't go to war, because I've been at some of those cliff dwelling places, and they are gnarly to get around. Some of the trails at the edge of the cliff are like, 6-8 inches long or wide, and something that had, a 32-inch head and maybe, 3-foot wide hips would have a really difficult time trying to ascend a trail like that, while the whole time the people up above could be dropping rocks on their heads. Science still doesn't know why they went to those cliff dwelling places during that time. And some have, wondered, well, maybe it was to get away from these giant humans that the conquistadors saw, So there's
Right.
really no way to tell, but, it's an intriguing theory.
No, I mean, the cliff dwellings like in Mesa Verde or even in the Verde Valley here in Yavapai County, when you go there, you're just like, wow, why do these people want to have their like communities in the dwellings? Now, one theory that I want to talk about is protection from the invaders or the rogue or the warlike tribes that were happening here. Giants for sure. I mean, if there's evidence, because I know there was a cave up in Nevada that they found giant skeletons too. I think it was like recently 10 years ago. But yeah, if anybody has never gone to like Mesa Verde or even like Montezuma's Castle, well, and there's some things in Sedona, it's really fascinating what kind of culture lived here. And another thing was that what it was about 800 years ago, so like 1200-ish, a lot of archaeologists here in Yavapai County are saying that some sort of climate change occurred and this people had to become more nomad, or they just had to get up and leave, and the seasonal patterns changed so they couldn't farm. And then when you go to those cliff dwellings, there's always like a storage area. So they must have been like saving their seeds or food in a way. So yeah, I mean, if anybody has not gone to the Southwest, it's very interesting because like you would have to have that imagination and also engineer knowledge to create those cliff dwellings, to stay afloat and keep your society safe.
Oh, yeah, and imagine trying to raise a toddler in that situation. I mean, you'd have to keep their eyes on them all the time. The other social media is Pinterest. And Pinterest, that's the other one I'm on.
Pinterest? Okay.
And I remember because Pinterest has people who collect these newspaper articles about these found giant skeletons, and it's all across the country, and there are hundreds. And a number of the Pinterest people have cited my stories, thrown that on the pile, because yeah, it's not just in the Southwest. In New England, they've been found. In the Midwest, they've been found. And really all over the country.
That's fascinating that Pinterest is spreading the word of these giant creatures. And like I said, when it comes to history, you should always question it because you never know who wrote it. All right, what the bias is. And then is there a group of people that don't want that indigenous voice heard, or covering up those giant skeletons that were found here in Yavapai County or in Nevada or elsewhere? So for me, it's always keeping an open mind. I'm never am I reading history and I'm like, oh, I hate this culture, or like, oh, whoever wrote this history is evil or bad. It's about giving perspective. And when you find those multiple perspectives, then the whole story of humanity, our civilization, kind of can give you a broader sense,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then there's the unknown, I mean, uh,
Yes.
man has had this brain for, I don't know, a million years, the brain size. And so, but the oldest clay pot we found is like 10,000 years old. Well, there's no way that humans with this brain capacity, in my opinion, would go 990,000 years before they invented the clay pot.
Mhm.
So there's a lot missing that we'll never know. And I'm kind of a theorist that man gets smart and builds, civilizations and finds technologies, and then there'll be a drought or a disease or a volcano or a meteor, and that gets wiped out. And nobody's thinking about rocket science when that happens, and all those technologies are lost. And, you know, some people have said that, aliens have given, these ancient cultures these beliefs, but either the Wright brothers, they discovered flight. No aliens told them about it. So why couldn't the Egyptians have found glider technology? They had the same brain capacity as us. So, I think that that's kind of what happens. Men get smart and smart and smart, and then catastrophe, and he loses it all. And like the Dark Ages, the Roman Empire in the Dark Ages, Rome fell, those technologies were lost, and we were back in the Dark Ages.
No, I agree. And that's why it's like, for me, it's interesting to see if there was a systematic erasing of history, like I'm a huge fan of Ancient Aliens, but again, some of it is a little too much for me, but it makes me think about, well, how come these ancient civilizations were able to create these monoliths and we have a hard time of keeping things built forever with the materials that we are? And I think you're nailing it on the head when it comes to human civilization increases, we get to a point of innovation, and then something random happens, and then I personally believe that we have amnesia as a species regardless of how that came about. Like, for an example, there's a lot of talk about the lost city of Atlantis. I think people have written more about Atlantis than any other civilization. And we're talking back from the Greek times too. And like with Aristotle and Plato, and like
Oh,
they wrote about it. I think it was also in the Iliad, I think too. But there has to be some truth to it, especially with the climate changing, with the Great Flood, whatever that could be, right? And so
right.
it's very fascinating that, like, when you talk about disease or a meteorite, like, I always think about what are gonna be the perspective of the next evolved humans going to think about what we're living in right now. You know, like, what kind of
Yeah,
artifacts are they going to look at? Is there going to be a layer of plastic in our
yes, exactly.
geological record?
We're going to be known as the plastic people. And they're probably going to wonder, how did they even make this stuff? Because it's kind of complex, chemistry and so forth. And they'll probably look at plastic, and eventually that technology is going to be lost. And they'll wonder, how do they make this stuff? And why does it last so long? And they'll marvel at it. There are some swords that have been found with metal technology that's beyond what we have today. They're stronger and so forth. And those old craftsmen knew how to do it. And since then, that knowledge has been lost.
Right.
It happens.
And I mean, I want to go into more of your stories, but you bring up another point about, like, when technology benefits our lives. Like, I love technology. I love that we're able to have this podcast through Zoom, and I have my phone and whatnot. But like, when you take that experiential learning component out of that, then when, let's say, civilization falls, like, who is going to know about electricity? Who's gonna be around to educate people, or medicine? Like, when I was in Cambodia over the summer, I definitely learned about the Khmer Rouge, and it's fascinating when, like, these, like, coups happen. The first people they kill, intelligent people, doctors,
Oh, yeah.
educators, and then you get a whole population where they don't know how to, let's say, be innovative, so they have to relearn. Well, who's going to teach that whole population, like, all those things that we learned. So it's very fascinating when groups of people take over and they wipe out the intellectual crowds so they can start fresh, but then you would have to learn things new. So that's where my mind was going with, like, well, what if civilization ended, like, but there's still people around? Would that understanding of like electricity or understanding of this technology be lost forever because nobody would have the ability or knowledge to replicate that?
Well, that's right. In Egypt, they found some small pots that had copper plates in them. And if you put an acidic in there, like lemon juice or something like that, it produces an itty bitty tiny amount of electricity, just enough to gold plate. And so some of these archaeologists, they're looking at these things that they thought were solid gold, and now they're wondering, well, maybe it's just gold plated because they had this ability to produce just enough electricity to gold plate things. So, that's kind of interesting too.
It does, and knowledge takes a long time to develop. I mean, think about like the primitive humans. How many trial and errors, or how many deaths do they have to realize what plants they could eat, stuff like that. So, changing histories, though. I know you like we were riffing about giants. I know that you definitely write about the history accounts of some paranormal experiences. So I was wondering if you could share some of those with us.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. One of the oddest things to ever happen in Prescott happened around 1970. There was a huge influx of UFOs at that time, and it all started with a seventh grader by the name of Dick Zabriskie, who would be about 63 years old today. He hadn't retired yet if he's still around. And he saw a UFO in the sky and called his family out, and they all saw it. And that began a wave of hundreds of UFOs in a matter of just weeks being witnessed by hundreds of different people. And one character who came into Prescott during that time, and he was a character, was a man by the name of Paul Solom. And he had this belief system that combined Mormonism with Hopi beliefs. And the Hopi believe that come end times, they'll be ushered in by visitors from outer space. And they've had that belief for a long time. So when this big UFO wave came, it kind of caught the attention of the Hopis. But first, let me get back to Paul Solom. He said that he was communicated to by these UFOs when he was in Idaho, and it was now his thing in life to go around telling people about these UFOs, which he said were from Venus. And he said, and if you heard somebody about this, that I talked to UFOs from Venus, particularly in 1970, it would have been dismissed out of hand. Not as many people believed in UFOs 40 years ago as today. But this Paul guy said that he could prove it. And he invited people to come out to a particular place and time. And about dozen and a half people came out, and he went by himself and started mentally communicating with the UFOs, calling upon one to appear, and it did. So he said, well, see, I told you, that proves it, and I can do it again. And he said, come out 2 days later at this time, and I'll do it again. So he had a little bit of a bigger crowd, and he said, come UFO, come. And it did. And this happened like 2, 3, 4 times. And finally, the editor of the Prescott Courier said, okay, well, we've been kind of ignoring this, but now we can't ignore it anymore. I mean, the whole town is seeing these things. And here's this Paul Solom guy correctly predicting over and over again when these things are going to appear. So one night, the editor went to one of these Paul Solom get-togethers, and he also sent out a photographer to the airport at the same time. And the editor he was going to be just straight line and matter of fact. And he gave this report and said, it sounds crazy, but this guy was there and he communicated and he knew when it was going to appear. He knew when it was going to disappear. He was right in both of those counts. And the editor said, just as kind of what you're saying, after seeing this, I got to the point where I need to keep an open mind. There were pilots who were coming forward and saying that they saw this, which in 1970 was very rare. There were even men of the cloth, reverends, saying, yeah, I've seen it too. Businessmen, all sorts of people. Well, while the editor was with Paul Solemn, this photographer who unfortunately had slow speed film, he was out at the airport and he saw the UFOs, and then he saw one come down and between the airport and the city of Prescott, excuse me, which would be, Watson Lake in the Granite Dells area, he saw a UFO land there and he took a picture of it, which appeared on the front page of the Courier paper. Unfortunately, the speed of the film was too slow, so instead of seeing a flying saucer landed, you see these streaks of light in a field of black, and that's probably why the picture isn't more famous.
Right.
But, it was a big buzz, and then April 14th, this Paul Solemn guy said, well, the big show is over, but a few more UFOs will happen. And he was right again. The big show did stop just when he said. And then a little later, the following year, it was March, he came with the Hopi chief, this 107-year-old man, and they came bound to Prescott, and Paul Solemn said, the UFO is going to land near Drake, and they're going to come out and they're going to say why they've been floating around and so forth. And the time came, and it ended up the UFO did not land.
Ooh, all right, so he was finally wrong.
Yeah, he was finally wrong the next year. And he said it was because bulldozers had been bulldozing the ground and disturbed it and destroyed it. And that's why the UFO didn't land there. Well, he ended up going back to Idaho, and he died in, fairly recently. It was like 2012, I believe. He died at age 91 up there. But this Indian chief, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, it was Chief Kachonga or Chakangwa.
Okay.
He was on the Hopi Nation, and he sees a UFO in a valley off the way, and he decided that he was going to go by himself to check this UFO out. And he went over the ridge into the valley and to check it out. And time passed, and he didn't come back. So the other Hopi followed his trail. It was easy to follow. He wasn't trying to hide his trail. They followed his footsteps, and they came to an end. They just stopped. And there was no body to be found. There was no sign of him at all. Just these ending footprints, as if he was taken up into a UFO, And they to this day, they never found the body of this revered elder in chief. So that's just kind of a odd take to this whole 1970s UFO landing and so forth. And there was another incident in 1953. There was a wave of UFOs so great that it actually made the headline of the Prescott Courier. And that's the picture in my blog, the headline of the Prescott Courier. And it says, "Don't look now, flying saucers," which they were called back then, "return to Prescott." That was the headline in the Courier. Wow. So Sedona is kind of known today for UFO activity, but I write about that, hoping for a little tourist travel here to Prescott from those people looking for UFOs, because they still happen today. You can get on YouTube and plug in Prescott and Prescott Valley, and people are posting videos of UFOs even recently today.
Right. Yeah. And like, I think that's very fascinating that the Hopi chiefdom just vanished. Like there, you can't like, while you were telling me this history, I was like, all right, there's no way this guy is predicting that this UFO is going to happen. It's like a monk episode where they have that drone and they can hoax everybody, but it's just certain things like when the guy was wrong the year afterwards, or the Hopi chief going out, like you can't explain it, because even if he got, let's say, got mugged, there would have to be some more footprints
Yeah.
around that. So that's very
Or if he was attacked by an animal, there would be animal footprints there. There were just his footprints
wow.
ending and no body. And so, yeah, there's no explaining that.
Right.
He had to have left the ground
Mhm.
somehow at some point. And how does that happen?
So you mentioned like flying saucers. Now, when two-part question, okay? First off, what is there any correlation from the 70s to what happened in Phoenix in 1997 with the Phoenix Lights? Like, I know Dr. Lynn Ketai, she's been a guest speaker in my class before about the Phoenix Lights. She's like the number one researcher with all these archived footages, and their round spheres that glow in the dark. And even the I don't know if it's the Hohokam in the valley, but there's a tribe in the valley that actually had petroglyphs up on South Mountain with those orbs, if you will. And just to go back to like the Hopi and indigenous cultures, when you're talking about their predecessors or their creators are going to come down from the sky, they're called sky gods in a lot of these indigenous cultures. And obviously we're gonna get into like a little bit of ancient aliens here, but like if there's multiple tribes, even the Dogon tribe in Africa and all these other indigenous cultures, and they're saying that we were created and it came from the sky, it's really hard to believe what came from the sky.
Yeah,
I mean,
true.
some of me wants to say it's also the notion of panspermia, where the molecules of life were hitchhiked on meteorites and they came in, and then the chemistry and biology happened in Earth. But like, it's so fascinating that like all these different tribes have these sky gods and whatnot. I mean, the Kachina, for instance, they're the ones that come down from the sky too. So I know I was going off a little bit, but like, was there any correlation of what these things looked like in the 70s to the 1997 Phoenix Lights?
Well, not so much, as people who study UFOs, they come in different shapes. The Phoenix Lights was kind of a triangle thing.
Hmm.
Uh, Early on, there were cigar-shaped things, and then in between, there were the flying saucers. These were the flying saucers, the disc-shaped kind of thing. Well, one thing about the Phoenix Light that people don't realize is they were spotted here in Prescott and Prescott Valley. They went over this area before they ended up in Phoenix. They were here first.
Hmm.
And there are not too many pictures, but a whole lot of accounts of people in Lonesome Valley area who saw those Phoenix Lights before they ever got to Phoenix.
Exactly. And like, I think that's like the most documented UFO too. Like, I think like 20 some thousand people saw it in Arizona. So that's, yeah, I don't know. It's really, for me, it's like borderline, is it the government or is it UFOs? And like, I want to believe. I've never seen one. Like, a lot of like, did you hear those booms? Like, I think it was a meteorite last month. I didn't hear them where I live in Prescott, but a lot of people were reporting that. Have you heard anything about like that?
Yeah, I heard them. It just sounded like an explosion. And a lot of calls to the sheriff's office. They were dumbfounded. And I believe that it's pretty much been figured that it was a meteor that came in that exploded in the atmosphere, because they did see some cloud trails. Somebody had take a picture of a cloud trail. And one of those meteorite explorer guys, he got on his horse and he got here in a hurry looking for it. I don't think he found anything. But, you know, these meteors actually, central and northern Arizona is crazily a magnet for meteors. The amount of meteors that have been witnessed hitting the ground in recorded known history is about 1,100. And I found 3 of them in about a 10-year period here in northern and central Arizona, which is just bizarre. There were 2 meteors that fell to the earth 150 miles apart along the I-40 range in like an 8-month period. And the odds against that are just out of this world, to put it in that terms, because the earth is spinning around and going around the sun, and 8 months later, another meteor hits within 150 miles. And then in 1920, there was one that hit. And of course, Meteor Crater. That didn't really happen so much in our time, but that's obvious proof. And considering the low amount of meteors that have been seen hitting the earth, central and northern Arizona has more than its share for some reason. And maybe that kind of somehow goes into this whole UFO thing. I don't know.
That, and I always think about, if I was a primitive person living on this planet, what does my mind connect with if I don't have the knowledge of that's a meteorite? So that's maybe some meteorites are embedded in all the myths and oral histories of some of these cultures too. I mean, the one thing I always talk about is 2,000 years ago, or more than 2,000 years ago, there was the polytheism out there, where Greek and Roman and the Chinese cultures, they blamed or kind of explained certain events like famine, plague, war, on gods. They had different gods, where now we know there's little viruses that can kill us, right? So it's not an act of God or gods, if you will. So it's just interesting how we have developed into this knowledge of, it may not be, let's say, godly, but when we can explain through science some of these events on our planet. So,
well, maybe it's not so much godly, but I would point this out. We've been taught that we're the top of the food chain. There is a dark but logical beauty to the fact that the so-called top of the food chain's biggest predator is the bottom of the food chain. Don't bacteria eat virus? I mean, there's the smallest things there, And so there's, there is a logic there, however it happened, there is a logic there. And that's something humans are going to have to deal with forever.
Yep.
Our biggest predator is the bottom of the food chain.
That's such a good point too. And, I always pose this to my classes, like, what would be the next species evolving to human? I always think it's the octopi, because the octopi is like the best. The octopus is like the most interesting animal there, because it can morph, it can shape shift. There's accounts of them hiding, like they put a shell over their head so the sharks don't eat them. There's those tests where they put them in a jar and then they get out of the jar. So anyways, we don't have to go over there, but
food out of the jar. They unscrew the top. Octopi are smart.
They are. I even saw a video once of an octopi getting out of the water and walking, and that was like a couple years ago. And that's where like my idea was, like, once they start coming out of the ocean, because it's just like the walking whale theory, like life happened from the ocean first, and then there's evidence of whales that just walked out of the ocean. Now, obviously it took like a long time for that evolution to happen, but when you look at what they're doing at the bottom of the ocean now, they're seeing different fish that actually have feet that are walking on the bottom of the ocean. So that octopi getting out of the water and walking around a little bit, I was just like, all right, we're done. We are done.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So do you have do you have like one last history before we get into your upcoming book?
Yeah, I have a little story to tell. It's more like a Twilight Zone episode, to be honest.
Okay.
Excuse me. It happened in present-day Chino Valley, in a town that used to be known as Jerome Junction. And if you wanted to take the train to Jerome from Prescott, you'd get on the train that would be headed towards Ash Fork and the Transcontinental Line, and you'd get off at Jerome Junction, and that's where you would change trains to head off toward Jerome. Well, Chino Valley has grown and is sort of eaten up what's left of Jerome Junction, I think, is under a subdivision today. But there was this foreman, railroad foreman, who was, checking out the line that headed to Jerome, and it got time for dinner, and he had his dinner pail with him, and he sat down on this rock near this cut where they cut a hunk out of the hill to get the railroad track through. And he's sitting there eating away, and there's nothing much to look at. So he looks down, and he sees in the cut this large vein of gold in the granite. Now, anyone who has ever seen gold in granite, it's beautiful. It's unmistakable. I mean, you cannot get it wrong. It's obviously gold. So he grabs a whole bunch of this ore with this gold in it, and he heads into Jerome Junction, which had a hotel and a shop and a saloon, like every town did, I guess, back then. And he goes into the saloon and says, "Look what I found. Here's this ore, and there's plenty more there." And he was breaking off pieces and giving it to the patrons there in the bar, and he's telling his story and going around and so forth. And he goes to the last gambler and gives him his last piece of ore. "Oh, you can keep it. There's plenty there." And he notices the bar's empty. So he goes out the door, and there's this scene of people trying to find anything to ride to get down 5 miles where this guy was, where this gold was. Every horse was already taken. As the foreman, he went to the house to get the handcar. A couple of the employees of the bar already took that, and they were heading down there. People were trying to get the stray burros to climb on them and teach them to ride right on the spot to get there. Some people gave up and just started running. And finally, this guy who found this stuff, he tried to get the last burro to go. It kept turning back and heading back for Jerome Junction. So he got off and he starts walking quickly to the area, and he finds people coming back with all the ore they could carry, and they bring it back, and they're turning this into banks and getting the money off it and so forth. But when this foreman guy goes back, he doesn't see any gold. It's like the whole vein is gone and disappeared and so forth. And these other people who carried all their good, they went back figuring there was going to be more there. There wasn't. And it's as if the gold disappeared. And there was even a mining company who bored test holes all around that area, looking for more gold, because if there was gold there, there'd probably be more. Empty, nothing. They couldn't find anything. And what really makes this a Twilight Zone kind of episode is the fact that nobody noticed the gold before this foreman did. There were railroad workers setting dynamite, blowing the side of this hill out, and then they would manually pick up the boulders and throw them in a car. And I cannot believe that a crew like that would do that and not notice a gold vein in the cut they just made. To me, I just cannot see that as being a possibility. So it's as if the gold was never there to begin with, and then the gold was there for 2 hours and people got it, and then the gold disappeared again, never to be found again. No gold anywhere again. And it's like, how does that happen? Did we kiss a parallel universe for 2 hours? I mean, it just makes no sense at all. But
No.
People found the gold and they turned it in, and then there was no gold ever again. Just very, very bizarre.
Yo, that's just another freaky episode of what happened in Yavapai County. I mean,
no, it was in the newspaper. They
right.
had accounts of the people who had the gold in this foreman, and they were all witnesses to it and showing the newspaper the gold ore and stuff. And then it was never to be found again, even when a professional mining company put boreholes all around that Lonesome Valley area looking for it and ended up with nothing. That's just bizarre.
you have a book coming out in the fall. It's called Murder and Mayhem in Prescott. So I would like to just give a little preview for our listeners out there to prep for the Murder and Mayhem in Prescott.
I'm co-authoring it with a guy by the name of Bradley Courtney, who is the Whiskey Row historian. He's written 2 books about Whiskey Row history, and he wanted to write about some of the murders around Whiskey Row, but he really didn't have enough to make a book. So the 2 of us got together, and he wrote about some of the Whiskey Row murders, and I wrote about some of the other ones in Yavapai County, and some of the mayhem, like the story of J.S. Acker, who Acker Night is named after in Acker Park. He suffered a dynamite attack from people. Yeah, a dynamite attack.
A dynamite attack? Okay, please tell me more.
On his house, yeah. And he survived it, fortunately, but it was thought that he was poisoning dogs. And some guy who lost his dog evidently was really angry about it and threw a stick of, it was called like gigantic powder or something like that. And it seems it was aiming for the parlor window, but it fell short and hit below it and blew out dirt over the sidewalk onto the street, broke out all the windows. And it was a wood house. It was thought if it would have went into the parlor window, it would have collapsed the whole house and he would have been dead. But, they put up a reward and so forth. And when J.S. Acker found out what the motive for dynamiting him might have been, he said, I know I would never poison dogs. I love dogs. I have a dog. Please, I would never do that. What happened was he had some rats around his outhouse, and he put arsenic-laced cheese around there to get rid of the rats. And then a storm blew down his fence, and all these dogs got in there and ate the cheese. And about 7, 8, 9 dogs, I forget exactly how many off the top of my head, died. And one of the owners got really angry and threw dynamite at him, but was never caught, and eventually kind of blew over and so forth. But yeah, that's one of the mayhem stories I have in there. And yeah, some of the more interesting murders and the motives behind those murders. It's kind of a true crime story, kind of a book. Obviously a true crime book, but some of those murders are actually quite colorful, and the outcomes are colorful. A lot of times people who killed somebody got off fairly easily, and even got off outright when the evidence was just tremendous against them. But such happens in the Old West and so forth.
Right.
So yeah, there's I'm trying to think how many chapters. About 20 or so. It's getting proofed now, and we're looking forward to it coming out, and I'm looking forward to writing some more history books in the future. I started writing the blog thinking I would eventually self-publish a book, but the blog became popular enough that the History Press, the publishers that do a lot of local history books, they're out of the Carolinas, they noticed my blog and they invited me to write a book, which I didn't even know publishers did that. I thought they would spend all their time rejecting manuscripts, so I was really shocked and really happy and excited, as you can imagine. So yeah, that's coming out in September of 2020 is when it's due. And hopefully by then we'll be able to go out to the stores and look at it.
Right. Yeah. And I would like to invite you back on to do another piece about the actual release date of your,
Yeah,
of your
sure.
book.
I would enjoy doing that. Absolutely. And I'll get more into some of the more colorful murders. There was one lady who was spurned by her suitor, and she made up this rape story and irritated her brother enough that he went out and shot this guy, and he ended up going to prison, and she ended up getting off because when her trial came, she asked for a retrial, was granted, and one of the witnesses died and the other skedaddled, and so she got off. But it wasn't good times for her. She was at age 19, she went into prostitution, which was legal in Prescott at that time. And because of all this newspaper coverage about her story throughout the entire state, she became ridiculously popular. And the name of the chapter is oh goodness. The name, let me think of the name of the chapter. Here it is. The name of the chapter is A Makeshift Underground Tourist Attraction. And there were guys who were, shooting at each other over who was next in line to meet her and so forth. And I won't give away the end of the story, but, just kind of little interesting bits of history like that.
Right. Yeah. And again, that's local history that I don't think a lot of people have known unless they did their research on their own. And like you're doing that. And I just want to, again, affirm you for following your passion. You started the blog, as you said, just for you potentially self-publishing it, and you followed your passion, and now you'll have a book published, and a publisher went after you. So kudos to you, Drew, for just keep on producing that content and just, doing what makes you happy, and
yeah, I would you do what makes you happy, and everything else will fall into place. That is my advice to your class. Follow your desires, the money will follow you.
Right. Well, Drew, I had a great time learning a little bit more about Prescott's history, and looking forward to your colorful book coming up, Murder and Mayhem in Prescott.
Well, thank you. And and don't forget my social media,
Right.
Celebrating Historic Prescott, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter. So follow me on that. And, like I said, I have pick of the day, and a lot of people will join those groups just for that. But let's do this again sometime soon, Robert.